If you have a need to turn on closed captioning or the transcript, you can see that if you click onto the little ellipsis at the top of your screen. As a reminder, we ask that folks mute themselves when they join. So it helps us limit the amount of background noise that gets in the way sometimes of folks being able to hear, especially I am in the process of slowly but surely losing my hearing. It was a matter of time for me. And so I appreciate when there's not a lot of background noise. It helps me be able to pick out the words and find the words that I'm looking for. I want to begin, as we always do, with thanking our team here in the grants management unit, all of our analysts who are working tirelessly to do the best we can to get through all of the budget revisions and requests for reimbursement, support our subrecipients and our partners and colleagues and friends here in the Department of Education, who we also appreciate greatly and appreciate the chances to collaborate and work together on those. Just as a reminder, in terms of the formatting for these office hours, I do have built throughout, whoops, wrong button. I do have built throughout the presentation opportunities for us to pause in the content to receive any questions that you might have or have a discussion if there's something that needs a little bit more clarification. So we'll ask that you hold your questions until we get to those specific slides. But if you have questions pop up in the meantime, feel free to put them into the chat, and then I'll go back to the chat when we hit those slides to catch us up on any questions or comments that may have come through on that content. The PowerPoint presentation is attached to today's meeting invite in PDF form. I frequently find a typo or something that might need to be clarified in the PowerPoint as I'm presenting it, even though I've looked at it maybe 35,000 times in the last 24 hours, especially. So if I do update it, I'll replace the attachment on the meeting invite with the updated version. I think at some point I will get very good at finding all those errors as we go. My OC tendencies support me in trying to get to that place, and oftentimes, as many of you know, when you're looking at something very close up, it's often hard to see the trees or the forest for the bark that's in front of you. So we will go ahead and get started, and as I said, we will stop along the way as we get to any questions or those pauses in those places. As a reminder, today we are talking about, I was joking with a colleague earlier this morning that when they woke up, they said, oh, it's Office Hour Wednesday. And I was also excited this morning when I woke up. It's Office Hour Wednesday. We're excited to have everybody here joining us today. As you may know, we've been holding monthly office hours or a quarterly subrecipient meeting every month on the third Wednesday of the month, beginning at 10 a.m. And this is our effort, one of our efforts as part of our continuous improvement processes that we are working through here in the Student Investment Division, the Grants Management Unit, especially and specifically for today's purposes. And so the office hours help us create some resources and have some conversations and dialogues that we hope that are supportive and useful to you. As those resources, they become permanent products that you can reference. And we hope to find a way to share these recordings soon. We've been assured that the capacity exists within the team's platform to share the recording outside of our agency. So I'm looking forward to hounding my friend Glenn Meyer from the department to teach me how to do that so that I can share not just only this recording, but all the recordings of all the previous office hours and quarterly subrecipient meetings. So today we're going to be talking about subawards as legal contracts, which is, I'm sure, just a fascinating and invigorating topic of conversation for all of you. I was excited to get to pull the material for today's presentation together. And so hopefully it's helpful for all of you. We're going to talk about key terms and resources. we'll look at, we're going to start at a high level, around 60,000 foot view. What are the state and federal regulations that impact and pertain to subawards at the process? Looking specifically at some of the state's specific requirements and policies and processes, including the subaward packet and what must be included in that subaward packet, some of the processes that must be engaged in as we put together that subaward packet. And then finally, we'll get down to more finer view here at the department and look at those resources and how those requirements and
So is this office hours or the quarterly?
so I just muted. Thank you for asking. This is the office hour specific to subawards as legal contracts. I'm going to quickly mute everyone and then unmute myself. So hold on. Maybe having a delay. So just as a reminder, once you've joined, we appreciate it if you mute your microphone so that we don't have the background noise. And I know it's quite likely you'll be interrupted at some point during this meeting with a question from a colleague. So appreciate you keeping your microphone muted as we go. All right, so starting high level federal state regulations down to the state's policies of all that are required for all state agencies, and then looking specifically at the department. And so first off, we have 2 slides here of key terms. Hopefully most of these are familiar to you, but I will also say that we have within the state grant manual, state grant policy manual, pages and pages of definitions and key terms. If you're excited to learn those things, we've got the links embedded throughout the PowerPoint presentation. Some of the ones I'd like to highlight here is the pass-through entity, the definition of that. At the federal level, it's a non-federal entity, so not a federal agency, but any other entity outside of that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out part of that federal program that comes from 2 CFR, the CFR for Code of Federal Regulations, and we're going to talk about where that comes from. So for the purposes of today's discussion, the Department of Education is considered the pass-through entity. And so we'll be talking about what that means in terms of the responsibilities of the Department of NDE, in terms of the oversight, monitoring, those kinds of requirements, what we have to do to make sure that we're following all the state and federal regulations. Sorry, click too fast. And then subrecipients, that's all of you. We appreciate you joining us today and for the work that you do to take the funding and put it into action, make it implemented so that it has the chances of achieving the goals and the purposes for which the funding was provided. So that is also a non-federal entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity, understanding that's us, the department, and it's to carry out the terms of the originating award. So this doesn't reference a single individual, but an entity. Most often in the Department of Education, our subrecipients and our non-federal entities are our school districts and our charter schools. And then we also, of course, are grateful that we get to work with so many community-based organizations. I often think of a safety net, and then when we all have all of our ducks in a row, that we provide that good comprehensive safety and supports to kids, families, and educators of this state to have the kinds of supports and resources that we hope will be effective in generating positive outcomes, where those are academic or behavioral or mental health, those various things. So the state has a number of resources that they provide to support state agencies in the process and in our requirements to support compliance with all of the federal and state regulations and policies. I hope that one of the things you come away from this office hour with is perhaps a renewed appreciation for just how many policies and regulations impact what looks to be at the surface level, oftentimes a relatively straightforward and uncomplicated process. There are many federal regulations, state policies, state laws and regulations that impact the work. And so The Governor's Office of Federal Assistance, which was formerly known as the State Grant Office. They've been reorganized and brought into the Governor's Finance Office. And they're in the process of, so if you click on the link to their website there, you'll see that it's under construction, that website. So they're in the process of transitioning from their role as the Nevada Grant Office to their role within the Governor's Office as the Office of Federal Assistance. But the state has had and maintained a number of manuals and resources that are useful and that absolutely guide and define, in many cases, our processes as a state agency for how we push subawards and funding through to our subrecipient partners. So the Nevada Grant Manual is pretty high level. That's that 60,000-foot view that gives an overview of the process in general. The Nevada Grant Policy Manual goes piece by piece in a very uniform and prescriptive way to talk about each of the important elements. That's the key terms and definitions that I referenced at the beginning of the meeting. There are pages and pages of those with a lot of really detailed information within the Nevada Grant Policy Manual. The Governor's Office of Federal Assistance also publishes uniform guidance summary updates. We're going to talk about what uniform guidance is. Many of you are probably familiar with this lovely book, Edgar, currently on the 4th edition. This is helpful information from uniform guidance that is especially applicable to our work here at the department. I said something to some of our colleagues here in the grants management unit yesterday because I have all my tabs and notes throughout, and I've referenced it and said it was my Bible study, right? So Edgar has, in many cases, been seen as sort of the defining expert and final word on a lot of the things that we do. So it's interesting how often I get to go back to Edgar and reference that. Then the state also has a Department of Administration, and they maintain the state administrative manual. And again, as a state agency, this is something that the Department of Education is absolutely required to comply with and to follow and adhere to all of the policies and processes and steps that are defined in the state administrative manual. It is a large manual, but there are a number of sections that are specific to the content of today's meeting in terms of subawards as legal contracts, but also the processes, for example, for executing payments on the back end, for bringing in funding from the federal government through a work program and that process for those things. So if you have not had a chance to peruse these resources, I would encourage you to do so, at least so that you can see at a very high level what types of information the state provides, the state meaning capital T, capital S at a high level for all state agencies, that all state agencies have to follow all of the policies, processes, procedures, et cetera, that are defined and outlined in the grant manual, the grant policy manual, the state administrative manual. You don't have to have it memorized and perhaps bookmarked like I have my Edgar book, but I think it is helpful to at least be aware that those things are in place and that all of the steps that I think sometimes probably feel like a little arduous and that we're making up extra work for all of you to do, whether you're our subrecipient partners or our friends and colleagues from the department. We really try not to do that. And so usually if there's a process, required steps, required information, you're going to find those requirements in one of these manuals and these resources that are provided by the state. So uniform guidance. So in 2014, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a federal agency, combined what were known as circulars at the time and codified those into the Code of Federal Regulations, Title II, and specifically Section 200, which is often referenced as 2 CFR 200. This gives guidance and information requirements, federal regulations regarding the management of federal grant funds. And you can see there that there's the federal government maintains a website, ECFR, it's the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. You can click on that link to take you specifically to Title II, Part 200. But you can also, if there are additional subsections after that, for example, one I've been looking in lately is 200 Part 320, Section 320 of Part 200. One of the ones that we looked at yesterday when I referenced my Bible study. You can search that in Google anytime. So if you type in 2 CFR 200, you'll find this link. If you have more specific information, you add that .320 after, that will take you directly to .320, that section. So all federal agencies are required to abide by the regulations and uniform guidance in the Code of Federal Regulations. And then by default, when the state accepts funds from the federal government or any other entity, they're also agreeing to meet the requirements of those federal regulations. And so oftentimes I like to think of it that money comes with strings attached, almost always. As I was giving my kids allowances growing up, there was an understanding that there were some strings attached to that, oftentimes associated with things like keeping up to date on their chores and their homework, those kinds of things. And so by receiving and accepting the federal funds, state agencies are also receiving and accepting all of the federal regulations and requirements that are associated with and attached to that funding stream. So then as pass-through entities, as we are at a state agency, we can add or modify those federal requirements, but we can only make them more stringent. We can't loosen them up and make them wider and more flexible. But that is done through very prescribed processes that you will find in the state grant manual, grant policy manual, or state administrative manual for the process of bringing in, accepting those federal funds, attesting to, agreeing to, that we will abide by all of the associated requirements and regulations with that funding stream. And then if we are wanting to become more prescriptive in those requirements, then there are processes for that as well. Recognizing that we operate in a democracy and we want to ensure that all the folks, the right agencies, the right branches of government are playing their role in that process. So here's a table from the Nevada Grant Manual that provides an overview of uniform guidance by subparts and appendices. And so you can see there, for example, subpart C is in the section 200 series, subpart D starts in the section 300 series, where you see that .3XX at the end, looking specifically at subpart D, that row where it says post-award requirements. That's a lot of the work that we do, of course. And you can see that it starts in the 300 series there. The state also has a number of laws and regulations that also govern our process. So the grant manual, the grant policy manual, state administrative manual are tied to Nevada revised statutes, state laws, and Nevada administrative code, state regulations. And so we can, as a state agency, apply regulations and requirements to grant funding, and that's often tied to the program authority, the stipulations that we inherited from the federal government or from legislatively mandated funding streams, and will often tie back to the intent that's associated with whatever bill or appropriations act that provided that funding in the first place. So if we're thinking about all of the federal relief funding that we are all swimming in day in and day out, especially as we look forward to the first round of funding wrapping up in 9 short days from now. The first act, the CARES Act, is the one that sets the stipulations for that first round of federal relief funding associated with the ESSER funds. And then the second act, the CRSA or CRSA Act, set the stipulations for that second round of funding. And then finally, the American Rescue Plan Act set the stipulations, requirements, and limitations for the final round of federal relief funding. So often we talk about that as ARP ESSER 3, that final round. So those enabling legislation appropriation acts provide a lot of the information about that particular funding stream. What would be allowable uses and expenditures for that funding stream? What are some of the reporting requirements? Who are the types of subrecipient entities that funding can go to, et cetera. And then the state administrative manual rules supreme, and it includes a lot of policy statements throughout that apply to all state agencies, and by default are inherited by our subrecipients. And those things, again, are based on statute and other approved regulations. Here's a sampling, again, from the Nevada Grant Manual of some of the information you'll find in the State Administrative Manual by section. And then we often refer to the State Administrative Manual as the SAM. And you'll see by section some of the information that's there, and then how it cross-references to particular portions of Nevada Revised Statute of State Law. So we'll take a pause there. I'm sure that was fascinating conversation for you to, or dialogue for you to listen to, not conversation or dialogue, more a monologue. But if you have any questions about the federal or state policies or regulations that apply to grants and subawards, some of the sort of high level information that we just reviewed together, we'll be happy to consider those now. I assume that a lot of that is relatively familiar. And there's certainly a lot more details. What I just gave you was the very tip of the iceberg. But if you were to go into those manuals and peruse them, you would find that there is a lot of detail, and there are a lot of very specific requirements at both the federal, whether that's in our handy dandy Edgar book or other places of CFR, of the Code of Federal Regulations, whether that's in the state's manuals, in the state's laws, in the state's regulations. So there are many, many pieces that impact the subaward process and our management of grants as a pass-through entity. All right, I am not seeing any questions in the chat thus far. If you have any, please feel regarding these state and federal regulations, feel free to unmute yourself quickly if you would like to, or you can add a question in the chat as well. I'll use my teacher wait time to take a sip of my coffee, and we will go forward. All right. So as the pass-through entity at the Department of Education, we are the pass-through entity for a variety of funding streams that come into us. So we have a lot of federal grant funding sources that are entitlement funding, formula-based, that are non-competitive for subrecipients, often prescribed specifically for our school districts and in some cases our charter academies. And we also have a number of competitive grants that offices within the department, our programmatic teams, have gone out and applied for, competed for, and been awarded. And then that funding, again, we act as the pass-through entity for that funding to make sure that the funding that comes from the federal government passes through us and makes it to the subrecipient entities for whom that funding was intended. We also have the state grant, a variety of state grants that we administer as mandated by the legislature. Those are considered legislatively mandated funds. Once we've gotten a grant award notice from the federal government, or if there's been appropriation of state funding through the legislative session, then we start the process of awarding funding to subrecipients to the subaward through that subaward process. So within the Student Investment Division, we have our Office of Department Support Services. They support our program teams in submitting all the required information for work program, which is the process by which the state accepts the funds and acknowledges sort of all those strings that are attached to that funding, and then can provide, again, some more guidance and information about how the state expects those funds to be managed as they are passed through to subrecipients. So at the state level for us, as a pass-through entity, as a state agency, that process is governed by, again, the Nevada Grant Manual, the Nevada Grant Policy Manual, the State Administrative Manual, and that uniform guidance, state laws, state regulations. And so I've included just a couple of examples here from the State Administrative Manual. These are direct quotes. That grant agreements must be amended whenever changes to the original approved document occurs. That's one example. Another one is that state agencies acting as pass-through entities, that's us, become subject to the responsibility of monitoring subrecipients for compliance with applicable federal and state requirements for a grant. So as the pass-through entity, State Administrative Manual says that as a state agency, Department of Education is also responsible to not only make sure that we're following the federal and state regulations that govern that grant process and that particular funding stream, but we are responsible for ensuring that our subrecipients are also following and complying with those state and federal regulations. So there's just a couple of the examples of, I think, perhaps some of the frequent pain points that you may all experience as subrecipients or as our department programs, colleagues, and offices that say, we are not making up the requirement that anytime there's an amendment or a change to an original document that we have to do a full amendment. That's not something that we just created as a requirement for all of you. We inherit that requirement from the state administrative manual. And then likewise, all the requirements and the things and activities and strategies that we engage in to monitor to make sure that as subrecipient entities, all of you are complying with those state and federal regulations. That's not something we elected to do ourselves. That's something we're directed to do through the state administrative manual. Here's a snip of the process as it's sort of visualized in the Nevada Grant Manual. They have a pre-award process and then the post-award and then reporting and closing. And this is the second phase, obviously, in that. And you'll see this is a high-level view that applies to all state agencies that would be acting as pass-through entities and awarding funding through a sub-award process. But you'll recognize some of the processes and the steps that you've had to go through as a subrecipient entity to receive the funding, to have the sub-award put in place, to submit for your reimbursements, et cetera. So hopefully that gives you a sense of that very high generalized process that applies to all state agencies. And then, of course, Department of Education will customize those processes to align with our internal structure and capacity and policies, our department level policies and regulations, that policies and procedures that govern this process for us as a state agency within our agency. Here's another example of a resource that's included in the Nevada Grant Manual that I think gives a very good snapshot in terms of the differences of the various ways that we can get money to people to do the work. So we're taking the funding from either the state or the feds. It passes through us as the pass-through entity onto some entity that's going to do the work. And we can do that through a subaward or through a contract. In the case of a subaward, you can see here that the subrecipient, the difference between the subrecipient is that once they become a subrecipient, then they have a relationship that formalizes a relationship as to that federal assistance, where the contractor would obtain the goods and services or provide those, and it's a procurement relationship as opposed to the federal assistance relationship. So you can kind of go through here. Fundamentally, though, hopefully this gives you a good sense of some of the responsibilities and requirements of subrecipients versus those of contractors at a very high level, and why those are two different funding or awarding mechanisms, because they have different sort of driving, fundamentally those relationships, whether it's federal assistant relationship or procurement relationship, drives which path we go down in terms of getting the money through us and to our partner entities. So within the manual, if we are going to do a sub-award, we have sort of two ways to do that, two options. The option A, as a pass-through entity, will distribute that funding through a competitive process. That may or may not include funding for us as the pass-through entity for the cost of administering those that sub-award. And then again, we can do that, get the money out through sub-awards through a non-competitive process. This is a lot of the entitlement funding that we think about, often associated with a formula or some sort of flat rate that everybody gets. Again, we may or may not, as this pass-through entity, be able to take a portion of that funding for administrative costs. And so if you think about the number of analysts that we have in the grants management unit, the analysts that we have in the budget unit, in our department support services unit, all of those personnel costs, and then the associated operating costs that come with those. So for devices, for laptops, chairs, desks, internet, an email, a phone line, all of those things have costs, administrative costs associated with them. And so Each funding stream sort of has allowances for whether or not the pass-through entity can claim or use a portion of that funding for administrative costs to support things like personnel and equipment needs and those types of things. So if we look specifically at option A, we're going through a competitive process. We receive an award, a funding stream from the federal government or the state that will go to other entities such as state agencies, local governments, and nonprofits. This comes directly from the state grant manual again, and that those entities will then execute or enhance or pilot a program. And in a competitive process, obviously, that means that the subrecipients are competing for those funds with each other. And so the state agency, in our case, the Nevada Department of Education, will create a notice of funding opportunity. We often refer to those as the grant applications, and we have to distribute that to potential subrecipients. And I'll note that the grant policy manual has very specific requirements for that process and how we make sure that it's shared in an open and public and transparent manner, and has very prescriptive, even more prescriptive requirements for what the notice of funding opportunity has to include, the information that has to be there for all subrecipients who are considering applying, so they all have access to the same information. Once all of the applications have been collected and received by the department, then we go through a process of evaluating and ranking, applying scores to those applications. So then those applicants that score highest are those that receive the funding through that competitive process. And there again is an entire section in the Nevada Grant Policy Manual that speaks about that ranking and evaluating process for proposals. So under option B, then non-competitive, we receive the funding from the federal or state government. We are going to pass that through to some other non-federal entity for the same requirements to enhance or pilot or execute a program and objectives. In this case, the subrecipients just directly receive that subaward. There's no competitive process. There's no review or scoring associated with it. And the distribution of those funds is often included in the federal grant application. So in the cases where a department office, programmatic office, for example, when I was with the Office for Safe and Respectful Learning Environment, Director McGill is gifted at applying for competitive federal grants and has, I think, a very high success rate of receiving and being granted those competitive funding opportunities. Could also be included in the grant award notice or in the legislative mandate that will tell you what the process is for passing that funding through subrecipients that it in a non-competitive way. Like I said earlier, most often this is through formula. Could be also just an equal divide up the pie and spread it among everyone. There could be some pre-negotiated amounts. For example, a lot of our legislatively mandated state funding comes with specific amounts for each school district, for example, or for specific charter schools. I'm thinking of Senate Bill 463 from the 2021 session that gave to the dollar the amount of funding that each of those charters that was included in SB 463 would have a right to as a threshold. Two more slides on the Nevada Grant Manual. The grant manual has a lot of information about the process for making payments from grant funding. And the process for making those payments has to be included in the subaward agreement. And the state grant manual prohibits us from making any payments until the funds have been encumbered and the subaward agreement is fully executed. We'll talk about what that means in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but at a high level, fully executed, a subaward is not considered fully executed until all of the required signatures are on all of the required documents, just like any other legal contract. So when you maybe applied for your student loans or for a loan for your house or a car, there was a lot of fine print in that legal contract. You could not say that you had successfully received a loan for those things until every initial had been applied in every possible location. If you've had the fun opportunity to use DocuSign, and it'll walk you through that. And if you haven't hit every single box with your initial, your check mark, your signature, a date, it will not let you submit it. And so the fully executed subaward happens when all of those things have been signed and dated appropriately. The state agencies in Nevada operate almost exclusively on a reimbursement basis, and that's true for the Department of Education as well. Another requirement for making payments is that the requests for reimbursement that are submitted by subrecipients have to correspond to the line items in the approved grant budget, recognizing that that grant budget is a component and required document for inclusion in the subaward packet and is therefore part of the legal contract. The request for reimbursement has to include the backup documentation. This is a state level requirement that we then help all of our subrecipients comply with through our processes here at the Department of Ed. The state's authorized representative or their designee, that would be us within the Department of Education, and specific to the fiscal components of that, the grants management unit. We are responsible, as I mentioned earlier, when we take the funding as the pass-through entity, we're agreeing that we will take on the role of monitoring for compliance, our subrecipients, and ensuring that they're complying with all state and federal regulations. And so one of our responsibilities in that is to review each request for reimbursement, make sure that it's allowable, reasonable, necessary. Did it meet the requirements of the grant? And where those things are determined based on in review of the approved grant budget, expenditures to date, performance reports, etc. Another requirement that some of you may have experienced a little bit of a pain point on is that we can't actually pay you as a state agency unless your entity has a vendor number from the state's Office of the Controller. And so that's why there's a requirement for you to apply for and receive a vendor number so that we have a mechanism to get the money to you through our processes. All right, one last quick slide from the grant manual. This just shows a high-level overview of some of the fiscal reporting requirements that we have and the purpose that's associated with those. And so you can see, for example, that the tracking ensures timeliness. I'm thinking about the reports that I run for our programmatic directors here in the department every month for our financial briefings with them, office by office. I provide them information in terms of where they are at in each of the grants that their team administers from the programmatic side in terms of their subrecipients spending down their funding in a timely fashion. So you can see that that tracking ensures that timeliness, that the tracking ensures that we're complying with the Code of Federal Regulations and that we're meeting state requirements as well. So hopefully that gives you a good idea in terms of some of why the reasons that we do some of the things we do here in the grants management unit, specifically as it relates to the grant manual, the Nevada grant manual. And I will stop here for any questions. I have not seen, it's a quiet group today in the chat, which is fine. All right, Pat's got a question. Pat, go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Amber.
Hi, Pat.
Thanks for this. I have a question regarding, you talked about the budgets and the amendments.
Mhm.
So like I have a couple of federal grants that I manage and they allow for like a 10% move between categories without a formal amendment. So is the department heading in that direction in order to allow that within their subawards?
Yes, thanks, Pat, for bringing that up again. We've talked about this a number of times over the past several months in our office hours and in our quarterly subrecipient meetings. We are moving towards the ability within our online grants management system, which is ePage, to allow for up to 5% currently of funding to be shifted within an object code. So if you have various bunch of line items for personnel costs for salaries in object code 100, say you've got a total of $1 million there in object code 100, you can move up to 5% of that between those line items without having to do a budget revision. And so we are, as I've provided a couple of updates on this in past times together, on these GMU Wednesdays, that we're in the process of working with our vendor from ePage. It's a software system functionality that has to be coded into that. So just as soon as they're done with that, we will be hosting, and I've got it on one of the last slides here in the presentation, a special request office hour in terms of what that looks like once it's been built into the system. Unfortunately, we don't have the ability to apply that 5% flexibility to our paper subawards, which is one of the reasons that we're working very hard to move as many of our paper subawards into ePage as we can. There are a lot of good reasons to do that, but one of them is that it would extend that flexibility to all of our subawards for that 5% within object code. So I'm hoping that we're getting closer on that in terms of the work with the vendor. And just as soon as we have it figured out, I promise we will be sending out an invite, perhaps with confetti, to celebrate that that's been built into the system. So thanks for bringing that up. Any other questions on the process, the information we just looked at that comes from the Nevada Grant Manual for distribution of funds through subawards? Any additional questions? All right. It's either really good information or everyone has fallen asleep, which is entirely, both are possible, right? Depending on your perspective this morning and maybe how much coffee you've had. So now looking at the Nevada Grant Policy Manual, which again gets into a lot more detail in terms of if the grant manual provides the high level overview of the process from start to finish, the Grant Policy Manual gives very specific guidance and information about each of those steps along the way. And so in the Nevada Grant Policy Manual includes a long list of all of the information that has to be included in the subaward packet. And I've compiled that list and condensed it as best I can here onto one very busy slide. So the information, some of the information that has to be included in the subaward packet is the name and the contact information for the subrecipient and the unique entity identifier, that UEI number. If you may have noticed earlier on one of the key terms slides, there was a definition for UEI, for the unique entity identifier, as well as the live link to sam.gov, which is the federal entity that you would go to as a subrecipient, non-federal entity, to apply for and be issued a UEI number for your entity, your organization. The subaward has to include the name of the awarding agency as the pass-through entity. The GAN, the Grant Award Notice number, and the CFDA number if it's federal funding. The subaward packet has to specify the start and end date of the period of performance. We often talk about the funding period, but we say, here's your subaward, and here's the time frame within which you are allowed to expend funds, right? We can't reimburse you for things that happened before the start date, and we absolutely cannot reimburse you for expenditures that are incurred after the fund date. That's why we're all so excited about the first round of federal relief funding wrapping up here in 9 days, right? There's a sense of urgency to make sure that all that funding is expended so that anything that's left on the table does not get sent back to the federal government as of October 1st. The subaward packet also has to say how much money we're committing to as a subrecipient entity. And that's a key piece of information, right? You want to know how much money exactly you have to work within. The subaward packet must also include a scope of work, and it needs to be specific. That talks about, we'll look at another slide that has more information on that scope of work in a few minutes. The subaward packet has to include information about how grant payments are made, so information regarding the request for reimbursement process, including deadlines, and also has to include information on how the grant is closed out at the end of the funding period. Once the period of performance has ended, what are those terms and conditions? An example that you all will recognize is the requirements for the final financial reporting and the deadlines associated with it. The subaward packet also has to include some of the state standard language and the state or federal general assurances. We'll look at those in more detail as well in a minute. But what I'd like for you to take away from this slide is that all of the information that we are required to put into the subaward packet, again, is not information that we made up. I don't stay up at night thinking about all the devious ways that we can make your lives miserable. We have these requirements from the state level on us as a state agency to make sure that we include all of this information. And so as we look at this at sort of that 60,000 foot view at the state level, and then when we get to the department's specific documents and specific information, you'll see a lot of this surface again when Kathy walks us through those here in a few minutes. The grant policy manual also dictates the process for how a subaward is started and completed, or in other words, fully executed. And so once the subaward packet's been pulled together, we have to send it over to our subrecipients. This is very easy to visualize and understand if you're thinking about the paper subaward process, but everything that is handled in the paper subaward process has its counterpart within ePage and our online grants management system. So we have, that's just nice for us because ePage creates that subaward packet when we create that application within ePage. And so we send it over to subrecipient for execution on their part. That means they've completed all of the information and they've signed it or attested to that information. We take that completed and executed grant and then review it. If it's incomplete, we have to send it back. We cannot move it forward, just like your DocuSign experiences. We cannot move it forward unless all of the information there is not only complete but accurate. And then finally, that we have to have an authorized entity, an authorized individual from our entity, from our state agency, as the pass-through entity that signs the forms to fully complete that grant agreement before we release the funds. So that's the process of getting to what would be considered a fully executed subaward. Once Deputy Hartz, as the Deputy Superintendent over the Student Investment Division, has added her signature, whether that's an actual signature on paper or by checking the box within ePage that it's been department approved. Not until that happens is the award considered fully executed. And we cannot pay for any funding until that has happened. We cannot pay for any expenditures. We cannot release any funding until that has happened. And then any changes that are made to any parts of that grant agreement within that subaward packet have to be captured through a fully executed amendment or some other legally approved method. So for example, we don't redo the entire subaward packet every time we have a budget revision. We can revise the budget and attest to it with signatures throughout and review throughout without having to, re-sign the entire subaward packet. Amending a subaward. A lot of the information on these slides are direct quotes from the grant manual. Let's see. A lot of the information, like I said, on these slides is taken directly from the grant manual, the grant policy manual, but I wanted to highlight this one specifically in the blue bold font in the first bullet. Because fully executed grant agreements and grant agreement amendments are legally binding documents, it is the policy of state to document changes to a grant agreement using a fully executed grant agreement amendment. So what I'd like you to note there is that the grant agreement, the subaward packet, constitutes legally binding documents. It establishes a contractual assistance relationship between the pass-through entity and the subrecipient. Grant agreements can only be amended if it aligns with the overarching goals of the grant itself, of the funding stream itself, and aligns with the purpose of the grant agreement. Using the use of a grant agreement amendment is required whenever there are changes to the original obligation, compensation terms, or the expiration date, for example. The agreement attachments, so we'll look at that in a minute, but we know that we've got a notice of award, we've got the scope of work that we talked about, the budget. If there are changes to those attachments and those exhibits, those other pieces of the contract, they can also be revised as part of the amendment. And those amendments must be numbered sequentially, and they have to go through the same review and approval process as the original subaward packet went through. So you'll notice from your experience with us that you submit a budget, an initial budget. We often refer to that as a Rev 0, revision 0, meaning there were no revisions. It's the initial original submission. That goes through programmatic review. It goes through grants management review. And then every subsequent revision from that to that budget is numbered sequentially. Are we on Rev 1, revision 1? Are we on Rev 5 in some cases, right? And those go through in that sequential order. And they must also go through that same review process where the subrecipient submits, attests that to the accuracy of the information they're submitting, programmatic team reviews, grants management team reviews, and then we approve the budget revisions through that same process. All right, another pause. I'll take a sip of my coffee again. Any questions on the general state requirements for the subaward packets and amendments to subawards? Kenny, go ahead and unmute yourself. Or the entire UNLV team. Hello, my apologies to everyone else in the room. Kenny, if you are talking, I cannot hear you. I don't see that you're muted. So
can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go. Yes,
go.
just like the Verizon guy.
Sorry,
yep,
there.
You're on. All right.
Teams.
You're
Thank
fine.
you. This is always so great and informative, and I think we're learning a lot. And I wish I would have known this like 3 years ago. My life would be so much better and easier. One thing, like, yay! This is great. Yay. It's awesome. So I'm thinking of the one piece of this. So when we get an award letter for something and like NITEP, right, that is sort of multi-year in intention, but is really often funded year by year thing. And we have staff that have overlap, and we are not willing to do risk accounts anymore because of this whole like thing where like the July 1 is the period of performance date articulated in the award letter, but then we have like a month lag just because of how the process works. And the memo, like we've been often waiting for this memo to be signed. We just stop doing risk accounting and we wait until you guys sign off before we do anything. But it often creates this lag for employees. And I'm just wondering, I know that ePage will probably make this all much speedier once we could get there. But I'm just struggling to figure out how we, obviously we don't want to do anything before it's fully executed. And because of this memoing thing, we're not really apt to want to do risk accounts anymore. And just trying to figure out how we can partner to better figure that out.
I think you brought up a couple of really good points, Kenny, and thank you for your questions. I'll note first and foremost that period of performance, even if it's intended as a multi-year grant, for example, whether that comes from the federal government or from legislatively mandated state funds, there are internal processes to the state, for example, where the funding is not actually guaranteed for each fiscal year over fiscal year. I think a great example of this is the pandemic, right? We had a number of subaward agreements in place that when the pandemic happened and due to the budget crisis and shortfalls in the state, we had to go in and sweep a lot of that funding, the funding that we could sweep. I was managing the several of the school safety account sub-grants at the time. And so we had to go and call every one of our subrecipients and say, what is under contract? What are you under contract for in terms of your approved expenditures in your budget? And anything that wasn't under contract, we had to sweep and we had to reduce the amount of their subaward. And so while it's, I think, nice to think of a lot of those funding streams as sort of guaranteed year over year, even with our federal awards, we have to wait until we receive a notice, bless you, Tiffany, for that we'll be allowed to carry forward anything that was left at the first year, for example, into year 2. And so there's a process for both the federal government and the state government in managing those funds, just like I think about it sometimes in the same way that I think about managing my own budget. I know I'm going to have to pay rent every month. I don't pay 12 months of rent at a time, right? I'm going to go month by month and say, look at my resources, look at my checking account and say, and manage those obligations that way. And so in the same vein, federal and state governments have responsibilities for sound fiscal management, stewardship, and processes to make sure that they're managing that funding in a sort of ongoing, interactive, and proactive process. So just because the funding appears to be multi-year doesn't necessarily guarantee that the funding will actually be there year over year. The second piece that you noted, I think you're talking about retroactive memos. We're going to talk about that again in a couple of minutes, but we have a mechanism to have the start date predate the date that the subaward packet is fully executed. So for example, if we have a subaward that finally gets its last signature, the money was available effective July 1 of the new fiscal year, the new state fiscal year. But for whatever reason, we don't have that subaward in place before July 1st. We do have the ability to create a retroactive memo that allows the funding to the start date of the period of performance or funding period to be retroactive to that July 1 date. And what date is available on that retroactive memo is sort of grant or funding stream specific. It could be the data that the work program was approved by IFC, or it could be the start of the state or federal fiscal year, as the case may be. Our preferences are to not ever have to write retroactive memos. Our preference would be to have all subawards in place before the funding period starts. Yes, so say we all, right? I think we can all cheers to that and say that is our goal. One of the challenges we have experienced is getting all of the parts, all of the people, all of the trains and cats and sheep, whatever you want to call it, moving in the same direction so we can get all of those things, all the review, the documents, the information that we have to collect, that all of that is done well before the funding period starts. And so one of the things that we've been working on here in the Grants Management Unit is called the Master Grants Timeline, and working in collaboration with our programmatic offices to say, if this is the goal, this is when we want subawards to be in place by, and many of those are July 1st. I'd say most of them are July 1st. What that does is that we need to reverse engineer February, March, April, May, and June so that we're able to manage the workflow, the workload of what it takes to get, I think, heading into July 1, that last week of June of this year, I was running a report in ePage, and we were pulling information from our grants that are managed via paper every single day to say, where are we at? How close are we getting to having everything in place by July 1? We have some funding streams that if they're not in place by July 1, then they go into a blackout period. So those are the priority in making that deadline. But that last week, the night before, on June 29th, I pulled a report at 10:30 at night from ePage. And of the 224 subawards that we were trying to get through for approval by July 1st, we had only received budgets in the Grants Management Unit. We had only gotten budgets for 110 of them, with about 25 and a half hours to go, right, to the end of the state fiscal year. And so we need to figure out how to get upstream on that process so that we're not backed up heading into June, and especially the last couple of weeks of June, or heading into the new federal fiscal year with October 1 start date, so that we have the capacity, the human capacity to manage that workload on the front end. So that's one of the things we're doing as a grants management unit to try to get out in front of that so we don't ever need the retroactive memo. And then part of that, as you mentioned, was our efforts to move things from paper into ePage that streamlines the process significantly. And you'll be happy to know that NITEP and Teaching About It scholarships are our two next guinea pigs. We've broken the system and our pilot a couple times, and with a couple of grants from our Office for Safe and Respectful Learning Environment. You guys are next on the list. So we'll be meeting on that very soon. I would assume within the month. All right, hearts for everyone. All right. Any other questions on the general state requirements and subaward packets and amendments to subawards? Those are great points to bring up, Kenny. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to click ahead. I am going to take a couple slides and then I'll hand it over to Kathy to walk us through the specific pieces. So we've started at the high level, the 60,000 foot view, looked at federal and state regulations that impact and pertain to grant processes and subawards. We've looked at the state specific requirements. There's the Nevada Grant Manual, the Grant Policy Manual, some of the references to the state administrative manual. Now we're looking specifically at the Department of Education as that pass-through entity. And so hopefully you can start to see some logic and rationale for why we get to this information at the department. All subawards that are issued by the department have to include, at the very least, a notice of award, a scope of work, the approved budget, and the applicable assurances. They may also include, as Kenny referenced, that retroactive memo, which would allow the funding period to start as of a date that predates the day that the final subaward is fully executed, that final signature has been added to the notice of award. It could also include programmatic assurances. We have a number of very specific things that are associated with sort of those funding specific or grant specific requirements that we talked about earlier, whether that came through the Enabling Legislation and Appropriations Act, whether it came through the grant award notice, whether it came through some of the stipulations that we identified in a competitive application when we went out and applied to bring the funding to the state. And then in some cases, there could be additional requirements that are specific to that particular grant or funding stream. We, as we've mentioned a couple times here, the department, we are still using the traditional paper processes for managing the subaward process and creating those legally binding documents that constitute a contract. And we also have our online grants management system, which is currently the e-page system. All of the information that's collected in the paper subaward process is also collected in the e-page process. So the same information has to be included, whether we're doing a traditional or an online mechanism for doing that. The acknowledgement, agreement, and attestation that happens through the online grants management system is indicated through those various steps, the workflows that are built into that application that you go through as the subrecipient entity to submit. So you'll recall most likely that there's three steps that have to happen within the e-page system for you to submit your initial budget and other information, and then for each subsequent revision, there are additional workflows within the request for reimbursement process. And essentially, when you click those buttons in e-page, each person that's doing that is de facto signing, much in the same way as they would if they were actually applying a direct signature to the paper, to the contract. And they're agreeing, acknowledging the terms and conditions of that subaward of that contract, agreeing to it and attesting to the information that they've provided that it is accurate and true to the best of their knowledge. So just want to click on that as we look through here in a minute as Kathy walks us through some of the specific pieces that are included in the department's paper subaward processes, that there are counterparts within the online grants management system as well. And that even if you're not physically putting your John Hancock to that packet, any of the documents within that packet, you are virtually applying your John Hancock and agreeing and attesting to those things as you are with any other contract that you sign. Because the subaward packet is comprised of legally binding documents, remember the bullet a few slides ago that I highlighted in big, bold blue font and referenced on page 52 of the Nevada Grant Policy Manual, because the subaward packet is comprised of legally binding documents that constitute a contractual agreement between the pass-through entity, which is the Department of Education, and the subrecipient entity, all of you, any and all changes, corrections, amendments that are made to any of the information that's included in any of those documents requires that all parties to the agreement, so that's both the subrecipient entity, all of you, as well as all parties here within the Department of Education, whether at the programmatic or fiscal side of the house, requires that we all re-acknowledge and attest to the accuracy of the information that was changed. And we do that in a subaward, a traditional paper subaward, by applying our direct signature, and within ePage by clicking through those workflows and those submissions. So that is the reason that we have to go back for signatures or initials every time that there's a revision made. I think probably the most frequent and then is budget revisions. Every time we send something back, or if we change any information on the notice of award, it has to go back through that process that all parties, as part of this legally binding contractual agreement, are acknowledging the changes, agreeing to those changes, and attesting to the accuracy of the information that was changed and updated. This includes some of the common ones we see if the funding amount was changed. For example, if we have an initial idea that a subrecipient was going to get $200,000, but in actuality, they submit a budget that's for $195,000, and we already had the subaward issued at $200,000, but now the budget has a different number. We have to go back and update the information on the notice of subaward to align with the budget, right? So all those numbers have to line up. If the funding period starts or ends, we're going to update that. I'm thinking of some of our federal relief funding that we were able to extend the end date because the federal grant award notice allowed us to. We had to go back, send those back out for resignature. Again, we're acknowledging and attesting to the accuracy and agreeing to those changes. Every time there's changes in the proposed expenditures as provided in the subaward budget, again, we've got to acknowledge and attest that that information is accurate and correct. And then if there are changes to the scope of work, that's less common, but that has happened if there have been changes to the scope of work. Let's see, I would like to, actually, I'll go ahead, kick this over to you, Kathy. Kathy, I didn't introduce her formally like I usually do at the beginning of our time together. Kathy is our supervisor for the grants management unit. We appreciate everything that she does to keep us all from losing our minds, I think, essentially is what your role is. I think that's in your work performance standards. Keep everyone from losing their minds. Kathy, you let me know when you're ready for me to click through each of these slides.
Perfect, I will. Thank you very much, Amber. All right, so I'm going to go over the our NDE notice of award for the general information. So the first section, and this is what our paper subawards look like. So this is paper. The first section of our notice of award includes all of the required information regarding the subaward agreement as outlined within that Nevada Grant Policy Manual. So that includes like the name and address of the subrecipient, the unique entity identifier, also known as UEI, your vendor number, your GL, and then we have our Department of Education information. So the education program professional, the assistant director, and then who your grants and projects analyst is. We have the project number, the amount of the subaward, subaward period of performance, whether the program is a state or federal, if the grant is new or if this is a revision, the federal awarding agency, the grant date to NDE by the federal agency, the federal award project title, also known as the GAN, the federal award identification number or the FAIN, the CFDA number, and then is the subaward for research and development, and then your indirect cost rate. And then below that, we have the project title, which also includes a bit of a description of what the funding is being used for. All right, next slide, please. All right, and then at the bottom of that subaward area, the terms and conditions included in the notice of award that are outlined within additional documents that must be included in our subaward packet. So this goes over the terms and conditions, and in it, this is where the contractual agreement part that Amber had talked about earlier really comes into play, and what you guys are, what every subrecipient is agreeing to as part of that subaward. So within this, it just has the terms of accepting these funds. It's understood that the expenditures must comply with appropriate state and or federal regulations, that this subaward grant is subject to the availability of funds. The subrecipient agrees to adhere to state and federal grant rules, policies, and procedures. The subrecipient agrees to comply with all the requirements incorporated within the subgrant. And so this goes into the attachments that are included in our subaward, which are usually we try to have in this order because we are under the contractual agreement for everything to be in this order. So the scope of work and deliverables, the budget, and then the federal and or state assurances, and then any budget amendments with the number when applicable. And then the subrecipient will submit all the information and reports to NDE that NDE may deem necessary for effective administration of the project cited on line 17, which was that description of what the funds are for. And then the subrecipient agrees to submit that request for reimbursement, otherwise known as an RFR, that must be submitted by the 15th of each month for expenditures incurred within the previous month. And so as we have talked about in previous office hours, that does include the $0 RFRs. So even if you have nothing to submit. And then the final RFR must be submitted no more than 21 days after the subgrant award period of performance has ended. And then it goes into the funds that aren't committed for the expenditure by the last day of the subgrant award period of performance will revert back to NDE after all payments have been made. And then failure to comply with these requirements may also result in the denial of an RFR. Next slide. All right, the terms and conditions continued. We have G, expenditures cannot exceed the approved budget in any object code. So this is just saying that within those RFRs that you are agreeing that to submit all requests for budget amendments in writing for approval prior to expending the funds. So that's where that legality of what Amber had said with the period of performance and contractual agreement comes into play. And then any changes to the budget must be approved by NDE prior to the expenses. Budget amendments will be accepted up to 60 calendar days prior to the end date of the subaward period of performance and should not occur more than usually once per quarter. Moving on to H, the subrecipient agrees to submit the final financial report or the FFR to NDE, and within that we do put that date. It does vary based on federal and or state grants. The subrecipient agrees.
Kathy, let me just note, here's one of the corrections I'm going to make to the PowerPoint before I reattach it to the invite. For FY23, this will be 60 days after the funding period ends for federal awards. For state funded grants, that will remain at 30 days. And those are both associated with the amount of time that we have as the pass-through entity to complete our financial reporting. So when the state fiscal year ends, we go into hyperdrive to close everything out. And we've got to get all of that done before September 25th. And in order to meet that requirement, we've got to have your final financial report to us within 30 days so that we have time to go back for corrections or clarifications and then also get any straggling requests for reimbursement processed. Sorry, Kathy. I just wanted to make sure that I highlighted that was an oversight on this slide.
Perfect. All right, and then this is the signature portion of that notice of award, which does identify the individuals by the name, the title that must sign the notice of award prior to the subaward becoming fully executed. So the top signature is for the subrecipient, then it's the NDE programs professional. And then once our deputy superintendent does sign that final, that is when you have a fully executed subaward, is at the time of Deputy Superintendent Hart's has signed that and dated. And then the final section of the notice of award provides all of our accounting data that is necessary for our fiscal team and our own fiscal management of the subaward funding. So in there, you'll see the state legislative bill, our NDE federal accounting numbers, or the CAN, and then our budget and category. And then within the different sections there is where you'll see where the dollar signs are. You'll see the amount of the subaward amount that was previously awarded, and then the total. And that's if you've had a revision or an amendment to the amounts. Did you want me to take this one, Amber, as well?
Nope, sorry. I was just slow at finding my mute button. You'd think this would be automatic. So the scope of work that we talked about a little bit earlier is generally provided by the programmatic team here in the Department of Education, because they have responsibility for programmatic oversight of the subawards and management of each of those grants. The scope of work defines the purpose and goals of the grant funding, includes, what are the expected outcomes or deliverables for that. At the end of the period of performance, what will you have accomplished with this funding and to what purpose? It will often cite allowable activities or strategies or expenditures that the subrecipient will be expected to engage in order to meet those grant goals. This information from the scope of work it can come from the grant award notification, from the legislative mandate, if it's state funds, from the work program, and when the interim finance committee authorizes us, gives us budgetary authority to spend that money. So there's a number of places where that scope of work could come from. It could also come from if it's, for example, one of the applications that Christie's office and the Office for Safe and Respectful Learning Environment has submitted. Thinking of the school-based mental health services grant. In that application, we were very clear about the types of strategies that we were going to use the funding through our subrecipient partners for recruitment, retention, and respecialization. So the scope of work is based on some type of source document, and it can be customized by a subrecipient if the programmatic team has deemed that it's allowable and appropriate. But most often the scope of work is going to be the same for all subrecipients within that particular grant funding stream. The budget is a required component. We have, I think, talked about the budget ad nauseum, perhaps, in our GMU Wednesdays times together. But I just want to highlight a few things. Because the budget is a piece of a legally binding contract, it is a legally binding document. That's part of that subaward agreement that creates that contractual agreement between the Department of Education and in place of the state as the prime recipient. Each of you must sign and attest to that the information you're submitting in your budget or your budget revision is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, and then it's accurate. And if there's any corrections or changes that are required to that budget for whatever reason, often that's object code or function code assignment. Frequently it's math calculations. If there's any changes or corrections that are required, once the subrecipient has made those changes, again, because this is a legally binding document, it has to go through the same submission and attestation process that the original packet had to go through. So subrecipient signs and dates, the programmatic team reviews, approves, signs and dates, GMU reviews, signs and dates, and if it's a Rev 0, then obviously Deputy Superintendent Hart's signs and dates and adds her acknowledgement as well. Our programmatic teams are responsible for looking at expenditures for allowability to make sure that they fall within that scope of work within the grant, the goals and the purposes and expected outcomes of that particular funding stream. the grants management unit, and we hosted an entire office hour on this, and we've published a couple of resources here, the budget preparation guidelines and the budget review checklist, updated July of this year. We review the budget to ensure that all calculations are correct and that everything's assigned to the correct object code and function code, and information that the object codes and function codes are defined in the department's chart of accounts. And our chart of accounts at the Department of Education is based on the chart of accounts that is created and maintained by the National Center for Education Statistics on behalf of the federal government. And so you can maybe start to see how all of these pieces weave together and lead you to the point where you're looking at object code 610 versus 612, 650 versus 652 to try to figure out where that particular expenditure should be coded. That supports us in our reporting, fiscal reporting. And we hosted an entire office hour on that as well. And looking forward to being able to share all of those recordings with you soon, as I mentioned earlier in our time together. I would like to highlight, I bolded all calculations are correct. I know that sometimes we make you crazy because we send back for corrections for math errors. Hopefully what you're taking away, one of the things you're taking away from this meeting is that because the budget is a legally binding document, because the Department of Education as the pass-through entity as defined by the Code of Federal Regulations and governed by various state policies and regulations, we have the responsibility of not only ensuring that we're complying with state and federal regulations, but we're also responsible to ensure that you all, as our subrecipient partners, are complying with state and federal regulations. The calculations actually do have to be correct. Because of that contractual relationship, this is a legally binding document. If we were to approve a budget and move it forward where we knew that the information was not accurate, we would be out of compliance with our responsibilities and duties as the pass-through entity in ensuring compliance with our subrecipient partners. So hopefully that provides a little bit more context, justification. Hopefully we're not being jerks about it, but when we do have to send things back for math corrections, corrections to object codes and function codes, it is because we are absolutely required to by federal and state regulations and policies. Hopefully that makes sense. The last section here in the subawards are our assurances. This is really important information, although I think like a lot of contracts, perhaps we don't maybe read the fine print as we should, but the general state or federal assurances, depending on if it's state or federal funding, have to be signed and dated by each subrecipient before you submit it, before we can compile that subaward packet. So when you're working with your programmatic person or your grants analyst to provide all of that information in ePage, it's very easy. You click on some buttons within the assurances page. Again, keeping in mind that by clicking those, you are virtually signing and attesting to, agreeing to those conditions. Or if you sign it, we have to have that before we put that subaward packet together because we want to make sure that you understand and that you've acknowledged and you agree to all of those terms and conditions. There could be, as we mentioned, programmatic assurances that are required. I'm thinking of the School-Based Mental Health Services Grant. Again, there's a requirement that the subrecipient provide a 25% match for that funding. It's one of the federal requirements that came with the grant award notice, and in fact was spelled out in the grant application process, the notice of funding opportunity that we responded to. These grant assurances provide very detailed information. So if you think about the terms and conditions that are included in that notice of subaward, sort of the high level overview, that information will be repeated and reinforced and provided with additional details in the assurances. And then this is, if you think about this and kind of reframe our understanding of the subaward packet as a legal contract, the information in those assurances is really, really important for you to make sure that you've read it, you understand that you're agreeing to it before you accept and enter into that contractual agreement. All right. We have made it through the core content of this time together. I was very worried about the time. So I'm very glad that we got through everything together. It's a slightly larger PowerPoint than we usually have for you. Hopefully it was helpful. Any questions on any of the components of the information that we just looked at from the Department of Education's perspective, and even anything that's now occurring to you as a question you maybe should have asked or wanted to ask from a previous section? I'll also note that I did realize that there are things in the chat and I just couldn't see them. So Kenny, I did not actually make my children sign sub-awards, but they did sign their life away in some other ways, right? By virtue of being fortunate enough to have me as their mother, right? And we look forward to continuing to reverse engineer into these things. And I'm sorry that you're going to hear my voice legally binding document again and again. Any other questions that folks may have on any of this information? I really hope that it was helpful. Deb, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm unable to locate the chat.
Okay.
But I am specifically asking about the amendments regarding the consolidated application.
Okay.
I also believe that some of the allocations are going to be adjusted, and I want to make sure that that the LEAs can weigh in on that. I know CCSD specifically is getting ready to submit an amendment in October for our consolidated application.
Mm-hmm.
And if we drop any adjustments prior to that time, it's really going to complicate our lives here. So
sure.
I just really kind of want to work through, how does the consolidated application work? Because it's always a challenge because there's so many funding sources at play.
Absolutely. It's a very complex application and section in e-page, right? That particular piece of it is very complicated because, as you noted, we've got a number of entitlement funding all lumped into that single application. We have committed, recognizing that we have done some damage to our relationship, whether that is a federal assistance relationship, a contractual relationship, or just the plain old good old fashioned human relationships, by dropping in additional funding to your allocations while you were in the middle of making an amendment to your budget, which put you all the way back to square one. That's not cool, and we're not going to do that anymore. And so we've committed in our various conversations that we've had over the past year, certainly to giving you a lot of good notice anytime there's going to be a change in your account allocation amount, especially if it's one that you did not request, right? So we're going to give you a heads up, and we'll be working with our programmatic partners in the Office of School and Student Supports, specific to the question that's on the consolidated piece of that, to make sure that we're doing a good job of communicating what those processes will be, what the dates for those will be moving forward. But I don't have specific dates for you right now. All I can tell you is that we will not, we're trying very hard to maintain our relationships with all of you from a positive and productive and healthy place. And we don't want to do that to you again and drop that change in allocation without giving you lots of advance notice.
Thanks so much. And I would certainly concur with Kenny. We very much appreciate these monthly meetings. So thank you. Is there anyone specifically at NDE, would that be you, Amber, because I know, for instance, the Title II allocation is going to be changing, that we should be reaching out to coordinate, when that new amount is going to be dropped into ePage?
Sure. So you do have programmatic leads at Title IIA, that's Dr. Silvana Gordon. And you are always encouraged to use the Universal Grants info email account. We are continuing to continuously improve those processes and our ability to respond to all of those inquiries within 3 days. We meet as a GMU team on a every other week basis, and in our meeting this week, that was one of the topics of discussion, was making sure that we are responding within at least 3 days, even if we don't have the answer, that we'll get back to you, acknowledge receipt of your inquiry, and then follow up with the actual information when we're able to find it. So I would encourage you, you can send an email to Dr. Gorton and if you copy the grants info, but we are already in the process of considering what that rollout will look like. And imagine that Director Lamar and I will be scheduling a meeting for our 2 teams. We're going to have your mom call our mom, and then we're going to get together and have a consolidated play date to talk about how we're going to roll these next things forward. So
awesome. Thank you.
absolutely. Oh, went too fast. I'm just gonna, whoops. Let's see if I can find my, whoops. Let's go back. And then let's see. Stop sharing. I broke the things. I was doing so well with the technology. Let's see. I need to change my share. There we go. And I think I called out my technology gods by thinking that I was doing so great. So just a reminder, we do have a set schedule for our upcoming office hours. Today's the review of the subaward is a legal contract. We have 1 more this calendar year. The schedule for these was determined by a survey that we sent out back in April after our April quarterly subrecipient meeting to all of you and said, what do you need to know and in what order? What is the urgency associated with these? So you'll also note that we've got, as soon as we have that 5% flexibility in ePage, we'll be scheduling that special request office hour. In the first month of each calendar year quarter, we host a quarterly subrecipient meeting. We have one of those coming up here on October 19th. We will always have our meetings, always, 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 on the 3rd Wednesday of the month from 10 to 11:30 in the morning. So hopefully that will help you plan ahead and you can block that time out on your calendars. Deb, your hand is still up. I think that you probably don't still have a question, but I'd like to give it up. Okay, thank you. And then finally, we really appreciate those of you that have taken the time to provide a little feedback. SurveyMonkey says it will take you 3 minutes, but that assumes that you're replying to the 5 comment boxes. All of the information is entirely optional. It's all entirely anonymous. So even if you would take the next 90 seconds of your day, point your camera at this QR code, follow the link, and even if all you did was click through those agreement scales, the Likert scales to give us, some feedback. We especially appreciate we appreciate the compliments and the positive feedback. We also really appreciate the feedback on things that we can do to improve our services and supports to you. Look for a survey, as I send out before every quarterly subrecipient meeting. I send out a survey to all of you saying, what do you need updates on? Do you have any questions? That will come out 3 weeks before the October 19th quarterly subrecipient meeting. We'll give you 2 weeks to complete that survey. Then I'll close it, I'll lock it down so that we've got at least a week to put any finishing touches on the content and we can meet those requests of all of you. And then finally, just a reminder that we do utilize the Universal Grants Info at doe.nv.gov email account. And we are looking forward to exceeding your expectations in our response times to all the questions that come to us through that, or to at least make sure that it gets to the right person who can answer that question. So thank you so much for spending part of your morning with us. Hopefully you enjoyed your GMU Wednesday time for the month with us. And thank you from the bottom of our hearts for all that you do to make sure that this funding gets to the places and purposes for which it was identified. These are public funds. Those make those sacred funds in my opinion, my beliefs. And so we appreciate all that all of you do. If we didn't have everybody working together in conjunction to get this money out and forward, none of that great work could happen. So thank you for all that each of you do, even if you never get to see the fruits of your labors. So with that, we will thank you again, wish you well, have a fantastic rest of your week, be safe, be healthy, be kind, and have a fantastic rest of your day.